Hey, special educators. Welcome to Teach, Taskbox, Inspire, the podcast dedicated to making your job as a special education teacher easier by making your instruction more fun for you and your students. Inside each episode, you'll learn how to get the most use out of your task boxes in the classroom. I'm your host, Lisa Hollady from Chalkboard Superhero, a veteran special education teacher passionate about empowering you with purposeful teaching strategies, helpful tips and tricks, and other classroom management tools that will help you thrive in your role. Let's get started with today's episode. Hey there, special educators, and welcome back to another episode of Teach, Taskbox, Inspire. I'm your host, Lisa Hollady, and today we're diving into two terms that every special education teacher knows, but sometimes struggle to implement effectively: accommodations and modifications. And actually, when I was just out of college, especially grad school, I often use these terms interchangeably. And I didn't learn until probably my second, third, or fourth year in what the actual difference is in accommodations and modifications. I just thought they meant the same things. But these are two essential components of every IEP, and their proper use can make all the difference in a student's success. But understanding their differences, knowing when and how to use them, and ensuring consistency among everybody on that IEP team takes intentionality and practice. So in today's episode, I'm going to define what accommodations are and modifications are, and I'll try to give you real-world examples of each and kind of share tips and tricks on how to document them, implement them, or even adapt them to your students. All right, so let's get started. So accommodations and modifications are terms we hear very often, but of course, they are not interchangeable. They serve very different purposes in a learner's educational journey. So let's start with accommodations. These are changes to the learning environment that allows students to access the same content as their peers. So the key here is that accommodations do not change what is being taught. They just provide students with tools and supports they need to succeed. So some really good examples of accommodations could include providing clear and defined spaces in the classroom. Say you have a student who is sitting in a beanbag chair versus sitting at a student desk, or maybe they're sitting at a standing desk instead of sitting at a regular size desk. Another one is teaching content in smaller groups or one-on-one setting. So maybe that student is getting it whole group and then a teacher is pulling them back and reteaching it again in that smaller setting. Another one is using visuals paired with that vocal language. So maybe the teacher is teaching a whole group up front, but the student has all of these visuals on the side of their desk to have them really understand what's being taught in the front of the room. What about providing access to cork boards or PECs for communication? That is a great accommodation that we give. Also, offering sensory supports or like a sensory diet. So maybe students need to have a weighted vest on. Maybe they need to have some sour spray. Maybe they need headphones on. So using these types of accommodations will help the student self-regulate and be able to participate and access that material. Also, using tools like text-to-speech or large print materials or using a slant board are all different ways to accommodate a student's learning for them to have access to that. So these accommodations aren't lowering the expectations for the students at all. They just kind of like level the playing field so they can engage with the same curriculum as all of their friends. Now let's talk about modifications, which is very, very different. Modifications do change what a student is expected to learn. These are for students who are below grade level or who need content tailored to meet their instructional needs. So some examples of this is using an entirely different curriculum And so something that I see very often in the field is a lot of people will use the ULS system, which is the unique learning system, instead of using whatever it is the fifth graders are using and their fourth graders are using, right? Another thing is reducing the number of tasks or assignments. So if you're asking a student, okay, you can just do 2, the rest of the class has to do 20, that's a severe modification that you're giving to that student. Another thing is providing alternate books with pictures and visual sports, or maybe you've lowered the reading level instead of using whatever text or reading materials that their peers are using. Another thing is slowing down the curriculum pacing or revisiting lessons weekly. So if you're constantly having to reteach and do this over multiple weeks, so if you're, doing fractions over 3 days, but for Johnny, it's taking him 3 months, that is giving Johnny a huge modification. Another thing is assigning fewer independent tasks during stations. So unlike accommodations, modifications really shift the goals or expectations for a student, which ensures they're working on skills aligned with their current abilities. And sometimes this just has to happen. Both accommodations and modifications are really essential to a learner's success, but they require consistency to be effective. So that's why it's important to document these supports clearly in a student's IEP and really train the team how to implement them consistently. Even for students without an IEP, accommodations and modifications can still be helpful. If you have students who benefit from these supports, you can review or document them with your team so everyone's on the same page. Here is a key point to remember though. Accommodations and modifications are dynamic. So as students grow and develop new skills, their needs may change. So revisiting these and updating these supports regularly ensures they're always aligned with the student's current abilities. That's why I wanted to kind of make this podcast right now, because it's kind of IEP crunch time and a lot of people are doing all of their annual reviews. And I often see the same types of accommodations and modifications on the IEPs for years and years and years. These I like to go over with a fine-tooth comb. And number one, make sure the student is using these accommodations. Say if a student gets word processor because they fatigue when writing, but the student is never using he chooses to write instead of using that word processor. I'll often take it off there because if he's not going to use the accommodation, I'm not going to force it, right? So let's talk about how we can implement these accommodations and modifications effectively. The first and foremost thing I want you to do is train your team. Make sure your paraprofessionals, your therapists, your gen ed teachers understand the specific accommodations and modifications for each student. So if in the beginning of the year, you have got to give them this list, and they might not know or read their IEP clearly with a fine-tooth comb enough to know all of their accommodations and modifications. So I make that a separate sheet and I hand it to every one of the IEP team. Now, if those change throughout the year, make sure you're giving them the updated accommodations list. And aside from that, on a side note, I hate to get sidetracked, but I also give them a completely separate one for any testing accommodations or modifications or accommodations. There are no modifications for testing, but for testing accommodations, I make sure that's a separate sheet because a lot of people are testing. Especially if you're in an inclusion room, there are times where I'm not with my students, and so they have to be able to give those accommodations to those students when I'm not there. The next thing I want you to do is document clearly. Use the IEP to detail what supports are in place and why they're needed. The next thing is to start small. Don't try to implement everything at once. Choose 1 or 2 supports to focus on and kind of build from there. Especially if the student isn't used to using their accommodations all of the time, they might get overwhelmed. There are some students that I inherit from the grade or whatever teacher they've had in the past. I'm sure a lot of you guys could relate to this. And they come with, 47 different modifications and accommodations. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And so, especially if there are a lot of supplemental supports. So a lot of times I cannot just give all of these things to the student at once because they'll tell me, Mrs. Hollady, I did not have this before. I don't even know what it is. So really just start small, especially in the beginning of the year. Number 4, be flexible. Trial and error is part of the process. If something isn't working, adjust it and try again. And very importantly, number 5, communicate with families. Keep parents in the loop about the accommodations and modifications you're using and how they're helping. And something I'm going to have another little side note here. Something I did with my 5th graders this year is there came a time where I said, okay, I can't give you your accommodations for this specific test. I think it was a field test for a science exam or something like that from the state. And I couldn't give their accommodations. And they were like, oh, what are accommodations? I have no idea what those are. What are you talking about? So I kind of wanted to have a whole lesson with my identified students. And I sat them down and said, okay, here's what accommodations are. You have every right to have them. Here's what yours are. Here's what yours are. And it's really important that these kids kind of have a voice. They need to understand that they have all these rights and they have these accommodations and they should be getting them regularly. And so we had a whole chat. So I want them to be more aware. When you have older students, you want them aware of what they have access to and what they don't have access to, especially once they get to the high school setting and they're like, yeah, I don't use that accommodation anymore. You want to kind of update that in their IEP and say, okay, Johnny's refusing this, 10 times out of the 20 times I had him this year, or however you want to word it, because you want any teacher that they're going to have in the future, you want these accommodations and modifications to be relevant. All right. So these accommodations and modifications are super powerful tools that can unlock learning opportunities for your students. Accommodations are how students access content, while modifications just adjust what they're expected to learn. So to recap, accommodations might include extended time, visuals, sensory supports, or assistive technology. Modifications might involve alternate curricula, simplified tasks, or even reduced assignments. Both require clear documentation, consistent implementation, and regular updates as students progress. I hate rhyming. Why am I rhyming? All right, so what accommodations or modifications have made the biggest difference in your room? I'd love to hear about them so I can share with all of you. So share your insights with me on Instagram or send me a message, email me anytime. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Teach, Taskbox, Inspire. I hope you've gained some tips and motivation to fuel your week ahead. If you're ready to explore more strategies for empowering your students as independent learners, be sure to dive into my free training at chalkboardsuperhero.com/training. And don't keep all this knowledge to yourself. Share this episode with your special education teacher friends who could use some motivation and inspiration. One more thing before you go. If you're finding this podcast helpful and want to show support, head to Apple Podcasts and leave your rating and review. Until next time, keep teaching, taskboxing, and inspiring.